to do the work, never labouring themselves. So how could they appreciate how hot and tiring pushing wheelbarrows was? The projects were all their ideas anyway, so they should do the work. Poor me, lucky them. When I became a senior monk, I ate the best food, sat on a soft cushion, and did little physical work. However, I caught myself envying the junior monks. They didn't have to give all the public talks, listen to people's problems all day, and spend hours on administration. They had no responsibilities and so much time for themselves. I heard myself saying, "Poor me, lucky them." I soon figured out what was going on. Junior monks have junior monk suffering. Senior monks have senior monk suffering. When I became a senior monk, I was just exchanging one form of suffering for another form of suffering. It is precisely the same for single people who envy those who are married, and for married people who envy those who are single. As we should all know by now, when we get married, we are only exchanging single person suffering for married person suffering. Then when we get divorced, we are only exchanging married person suffering for single person suffering. Poor me, lucky them. When we are poor, we envy those who are rich. However, many who are rich envy the sincere friendships and freedom from responsibilities of those who are poor. Becoming rich is only exchanging poor person suffering for rich person suffering. Retiring and taking a cut in your income is only exchanging rich person suffering for poor person suffering, and so it goes on. Poor me, lucky them. To think that you will be happy by becoming something else is delusion. Becoming something else just exchanges one form of suffering for another form of suffering. But when you are content with who you are now, junior or senior, married or single, rich or poor, then you are free of suffering. Lucky me, poor them. Advice for when you are sick. In my second year as a monk in northeast Thailand, I came down with scrub typhus. The fever was so strong that I was admitted to the monks' ward in the regional hospital at Ubon. In those days, in the mid-1970s, Ubon was a remote backwater of a very poor country. Feeling weak and afflicted with a drip in my arm, I noticed the male nurse leave his station at 6 p.m. Half an hour later, the replacement nurse had yet to arrive, so I asked the monk in the next bed if we should alert someone in charge that the night nurse hadn't come. I was quickly told that in the monks' ward there never is a night nurse. If you take a turn for the worse during the night, that's just unlucky karma. It was bad enough being very sick, now I was terrified as well. For the next 4 weeks, every morning and afternoon, a nurse built like a water buffalo would inject my buttocks with antibiotics. This was a poor public hospital in an undeveloped area of a third world country, so the needles were recycled many more times than would be allowed even in Bangkok. That strong-armed nurse literally had to stab the needle with considerable force to enter the flesh. Monks were expected to be tough, but my buttocks weren't. They became very sore. I hated that nurse at that time. I was in pain, I was weak, and I had never felt so miserable in my life. Then, one afternoon, Ajahn came into the monks' ward to visit me. To visit me? I felt so flattered and impressed. I was uplifted. I felt great, until Ajahn opened his mouth. What he said, I later found out, he told many sick monks whom he visited in hospital. He told me, "You'll either get better or you'll die." Then he went away. My elation was shattered. My joy at the visit vanished. The worst thing was that you couldn't fault Ajahn Chah. What he said was absolute truth. I'll get better or I'll die. Either way, the discomfort of the sickness will not last. Surprisingly, that was very reassuring. As it happened, I got better instead of dying. What a great teacher Ajahn Chah was. What's wrong with being sick? In my public talks, I often ask the audience to raise their hands if they have ever been sick. Nearly everyone puts up their hand. Those who don't are either asleep or probably lost in a sexual fantasy. This proves, I argue, that it is quite normal to be sick. In fact, it would be very unusual if you didn't fall sick from time to time. So why, I ask, do you say when you visit the doctor, "There is something wrong with me, doctor"? It would be wrong only if you weren't sick sometimes. Thus a rational person should say instead, "There is something right with me, doctor, I'm sick again." Whenever you perceive sickness as something wrong, you add unnecessary stress, even guilt, on top of the unpleasantness. In the 19th century novel Erewhon, Samuel Butler envisaged a society in which illness was considered a crime, and the sick were punished with a jail term. In one memorable passage, the accused man, sniffling and sneezing in the dock, was berated by the judge as a serial offender. This was not the first time he had appeared before the magistrate with a cold. Moreover, it was all his fault, caused by eating junk food, failing to exercise adequately, and leading a stressful lifestyle. He was sentenced to several years in jail. How many of us are led to feel guilty when we are sick? A fellow monk had been sick with an unknown illness for many years. He would spend day after day, week after week, in bed all day, too weak even to walk beyond his room. The monastery spared no expense or effort arranging every kind of medical therapy, orthodox and alternative, in an attempt to help him, but nothing seemed to work. He would think he was feeling better, stagger outside for a little walk, and then relapse for weeks. Many times they thought he would die. One day the wise abbot of the monastery had an insight into the problem, so he went up to the sick monk's room. The bedridden monk